Well, if you have a Bible, please turn to the Song of Songs, chapter 5, and we're reading from verse 2 all the way to chapter 6 and verse 2 there. Shulamite. I slept, but my heart was at work. A sound. My beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. I had put off my garment. How could I put it on? I had bathed my feet. How could I soil them? My beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart was thrilled within me. I rose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the bolt. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. My soul failed me when he spoke. I sought him, but found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer. The watchmen found me as they went about in the city. They beat me, they bruised me, and they took away my veil, those watchmen of the walls. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him I am sick with love. Daughters of Jerusalem, what is your beloved more than another beloved, O most beautiful among women? What is your beloved more than another beloved, that you thus adjure us? Shulamite. My beloved is radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000. His head is the finest gold. His locks are wavy, black as a raven. His eyes are like the doves beside streams of water, bathed in milk, sitting beside a full pool. His cheeks are like beds of spices, mounds of sweet-smelling herbs. His lips are lilies dripping liquid myrrh. His lips are lilies dripping liquid myrrh. His arms are rods of gold set with jewels. His body is polished ivory, bedecked with sapphires. His legs are alabaster columns set on bases of gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice as the cedars. His mouth is most sweet, and he is altogether desirable. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. Others. Where has your beloved gone, O most beautiful among women? Where has your beloved turned, that we may seek him with you? Shulamite. My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to graze in the gardens, and to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He grazes among the lilies. Pray that God will bless the reading of his infallible word this evening in Gisborne. Well, it's great to return again to the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. If you were here last week, we came to what was the central part of the book, where the newly wedded couple consummated the marriage and the waiting was over. We saw there again the countercultural message that sex is to be reserved till after marriage, that it can only be enjoyed with God's blessing by heterosexual married couples. A simple but yet vital lesson in today's culture. We also saw the man's delight in the woman, didn't we? He took pleasure in the words she spoke, how she had kept herself like a fountain sealed or a locked garden, preserving her virginity until the wedding night. And as the man spoke of the woman and all that she had to offer him, it almost had an Edenic quality to it. He was casting our minds back to the Garden of Eden and back to that perfection when we walk with God in the garden. But it wasn't just a lesson in romance. It was also pointing us to Christ, wasn't it? Once again, we were led to him and to his love for the church. And we saw there the amazing truth that Christ delights in his people. Even though our love is fickle, a bit like the morning dew which appears and then it's gone, it brings him great joy and great delight. We saw there also the challenge of living like virgins to Christ, to be those who are exclusively committed to him and forsaking all others following him. It's a great call to fruitfulness and to obedience for the sake of Christ. So that was the wedding night, and if you were watching a Disney movie, it would say now, wouldn't it? Then they all lived happily ever after. You know, the credits would come down the screen. You know, lots of Disney films actually end with the wedding, don't they? And it's for good reason. It's because when we're married, we realize that being married and being in that relationship, it's not all that easy, is it? It's not all a fairy tale. And the joy of the wedding day can often be replaced by the frustration of learning to live with another sinner. After marriage, the journey really begins, doesn't it? It doesn't end there. It's only just started. Ian Duguid, the scholar, puts it this way. He says, if fairy tales were honest, then Prince Charming would soon have discovered that Snow White herself could be grumpy, sleepy, and dopey. She was not always happy and charming. He said, Sleeping Beauty would soon respond to love's true first kiss by saying, not tonight, dear, I'm tired. And Belle, who married the Beast, would have soon realized that his anger issues would resurface and cause problems in the marriage. It's often after that perfect day of the wedding that the troubles begin. And it's the same when you read the Song of Solomon, chapter 5. Here we see the struggle in their marriage as the woman resists the man's advances for intimacy. It is another dream, as we'll see as we go through the text, but there are many lessons we can also glean from this dream. But even more than just lessons for relationships, once again, it's going to instruct us in our relationship with Christ. It shows us in this passage how we get ourselves into a mess spiritually, but also how we can get ourselves out by the grace of God. So with that in mind, I want to explore two things in this text. First, we'll look at intimacy lost in the marriage relationship and how that problem is solved. And then secondly, and more mystically, we'll look at intimacy lost in our relationship with Christ and how that problem is also solved. And I pray that God would give us a heart to receive both lessons, the lessons on the human level and the lessons on the supernatural level as well. So let's look firstly at intimacy lost in the marriage relationship. Now, as verse 2 begins, we're again at a new scene in the opera. Some time has passed since the wedding, and the woman has fallen into a dream. It begins the same way that chapter 3 begins, with the woman on her bed at night. Now, we know it's just a dream because the details don't make much sense as we go through the story. It's choppy, it stops and starts. It's going to be a little bit strange. But what are the lessons it teaches us? Well, look with me at verse 2. It begins, I slept, but my heart was awake. A sound, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, and my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. So the dream starts off pretty simple. The woman's in bed, the man's at the door and is knocking for her to open. Now, almost all commentators agree that it's a dream, by the way. I didn't make this up myself. And they also agree that this is a symbolic dream. As the man appears at the door with his hands covered in myrrh, that's obviously not actually happening. He's not actually got wet hair and he's standing out in the rain. It's a symbolic way of speaking of the man's approaching the woman for intimacy. His approach is like a man who's tapping on the door, an invitation for her to open up her sexuality to him and to let her beloved in, just as happened on the wedding night. But it seems as you look at the account, on this occasion, the woman isn't amenable at all. She refuses him access, if you will, for what seems to be no good reason whatsoever. Look with me at verse 3. She says, I had put off my garment. How could I put it on again? I had bared my feet. How could I soil them? It's an ancient version, isn't it, of not tonight, dear, I have a headache. It's a far cry from the woman who was there in the courtship with the beloved, who was willing to go out in the heat of the day and to be considered a prostitute amongst the shepherds, just so that she would catch a glimpse of the shepherd boy. Her passion for him seems to have died down a little bit in this section of the book. In this scene, she's making excuses to not be intimate with him, and this is going to put a distance between her and the shepherd boy. Now, it's just a story, but it's a pretty well-known story in real life, isn't it? This kind of conflict happens in real-life marriages all the time. This is why Paul had to give us detailed instructions about these things in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Let me read to you there from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 3. It says, "The husband should give his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the woman to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, so you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." The Bible's real about the kind of conflicts people have in their marriages, isn't it? How many marital tiffs in this area of sexuality would be nipped in the bud and stopped if the instructions of Paul were followed in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The reason people struggle with them, to put them into practice, is because sometimes this will mean self-denial. Sometimes one person in the marriage is going to have to be more up for intimacy than they would like. And sometimes in the marriage, someone's going to have to hold back from as much intimacy as they might like. But Paul's passage is clear, isn't it? Sex should be frequent in a marriage. It should only be stopped for mutual reasons or for a short period of prayer. So much for St. Augustine's sexless marriage. He must not have done much of a study on 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So this is the situation, and this is what the Word of God speaks to the situation. So in the story, just when you think the woman isn't in the mood, she changes her mind, and then she goes after the shepherd boy. Verse 4 says, "My beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart was thrilled within me. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, and my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the bolt." So suddenly she thinks, well, intimacy might not be a bad idea after all. She changes her mind, and she's keen then to let him in and to grant him access. But look what happens when she goes to the door in verse 6. In verse 6 it says, "I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone." The moment had passed, the beloved is no longer stood at the door. He's gone somewhere. We don't know where he's gone. But we know because of his character, he wouldn't have been going off in a sulk. He's respected the woman's choice. But now in her mind, there's a big distance between them. In her mind, she's thinking, oh no, I've let him down and it's all drama now. He's gone. Perhaps he's forsaken me. Those anxieties are coming out once again, just as we saw in chapter 3. But even though this is a dream, this can happen in real marriages, can't it? When sex is withheld from the other partner, the other spouse can feel rejected, and it can cause an emotional distance between a couple. You know, I wouldn't be talking about this if it wasn't in the Bible, but here we are in God's words instructing us. Too often this happens in the real world of marriage. Now, because this is a dream, the woman's actions at this point are not going to make any sense to us. Have a look in verse 6. It says, "My soul failed me when he spoke. I sought him, but I found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer." In the dream, he's just kind of vanished into thin air. In real life, that doesn't happen, does it? Someone knocks on the door and you come to the door, they're still there a second after they've been knocking. So she doesn't find him, and in the dream she thinks, well, it's going to be a good idea for me as a single woman to trek out into the night by myself in search of the shepherd boy. And once again she goes into the city, which is a place he would never even go. So she goes out, and then who finds her? Verse 7, the watchmen find her. Verse 7, the watchmen found me as they went about in the city. They beat me, they bruised me, and they took away my veil. Those watchmen of the walls. Now to us this might seem totally bizarre in this kind of a culture. And we don't have watchmen of the night, do we? We have the police. But we don't have people who are stationed on a tower keeping an eye on things. But an ancient watchman, he would watch over the city at night, and one of the tasks was to make sure there was no prostitution happening. It doesn't mean there wasn't prostitution in the first century and in the ancient world, but a lot of it was done privately behind hidden doors or in temples in kind of religious worship. If you were out on the evening, a veiled woman, you were considered a prostitute, and you would have faced the wrath of the watchman. You know, they tried to put prostitutes out of business in the cities. So I'm sure in real life they wouldn't have actually been beating her up, but this is a dream. This is what you see in the passage. And so a question pops up in our mind. Why is the woman dreaming about being beaten up? It's quite a strange thing to dream about, isn't it, at this stage of the dream? Well, many commentaries agree that it's probably a picture of her own conscience testifying against her. She's literally beating herself up because of what she's done to the shepherd boy. She feels turmoil on the inside. She knows it's wrong that she's been depriving him. And now that's manifesting in this sort of self-hatred where the watchmen are beating her up. The shepherd boy didn't deserve her cold shoulder, so subconsciously she's punishing herself for what she's done. That seems the best way to make sense of the situation, but it is a dream, and dreams are sometimes random. And you see a taste of that randomness again by all of a sudden she bumps in to the daughters of Jerusalem. She turns to them and she says this in verse 8. She says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, then you tell him I am sick with love. What does she do? She reaches out to the Christian community, to the people of God. And there's a principle even here, isn't there? In all our struggles and our marriages, we are to reach out to the people of God, because they will have wisdom beyond our years. And this is probably why it says in the book of Titus, isn't it, that the younger women are to be taught by the older women to love their husbands, that we're all to shepherd one another and to speak God's truth to one another. So it was a good thing for her to do, to turn to the daughters of Jerusalem, just as it's a good thing for someone to do who might be struggling in these areas in their marriage, to turn to a trusted Christian friend. And look at the advice which they give to her. It's quite strange advice at a first glance, but I think you'll see as we go through it that this was actually very wise advice. Look with me at verse 9. They ask her, what is your beloved more than another beloved, O most beautiful among women? What is your beloved more than another beloved, that you thus adjure us? So at first glance, it kind of looks like they're fobbing her off there, doesn't it? You know, well, don't bother us. Why are you talking about this shepherd boy for? But in effect, what they're saying to her is this. What is it that makes him so special? Why is it that you enjoy being married to him in the first place? And the reason they ask her this question is to stir up her original affection for him. You know, they're trying to get her to think about the reason she fell in love with him in the first place. And as she takes their advice, as she thinks about all the good points her husband has, her heart begins to go out after him. Now take a look with me at verse 10. She says, my beloved is radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000. His head is the finest gold, his locks are wavy, black as a raven. His eyes are like the doves beside streams of water, bathed in the milk, sitting beside a full pool. His cheeks are like beds of spices, mounds of sweet-smelling herbs. And all these prayers she gives to him over and over and over. And what's the conclusion to it all? She says, "This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem." So all of a sudden, she's not been interested in him, and only moments later, she's sick with love. She's describing him in detail after detail after detail. And it's all because of the question which the daughters of Jerusalem asked her as she meditated on all the good things about the shepherd boy. And there's a principle there, isn't there? You need people to advise you in your marriage who'll help you focus on the positive. Who'll be like the daughters of Jerusalem and encourage you in your marriage to keep going forward with your wife or with your husband. Because the church always has wisdom. It's in church that we find the mind of Christ among other believers, and God gives his wisdom through his people. But again, they ask another question, which is also super helpful for the woman to think about in her dream. Look at chapter 6 and verse 1. The daughters of Jerusalem asked the Shulamite, "Where has your beloved gone, O most beautiful among women? Where has your beloved turned, that we may seek him with you?" So the whole point of the dream is that the shepherd boy is meant to be missing, isn't it? She spurned him, and it appeared that he was gone forever, off into the night. And this is so strange, because look at the answer the woman gives about where the shepherd boy actually is. Chapter 6 and verse 2, she says this. She said, "My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to graze in the gardens, and to gather the lilies. I am my beloved, and my beloved's is mine. He grazes among the lilies." And what does she mean when she says he's gone down to his garden? Well, we know from chapter 5 that she is the garden, isn't she? A garden sealed is my beloved. So what she's saying is this: he's actually been with me the whole time. Do you ever have a moment when you're dreaming, when you kind of realize, oh, thank goodness, this is a dream. I can wake up and, I've not actually done this stupid thing. And, you feel that relief, don't you? It's just a dream. And she realizes when the daughter of Jerusalem actually say, "Where is the beloved?" Well, he's probably asleep next to her in the bed, isn't it? It's just a dream. He's always with her. He's in his garden. He's in the garden of their marriage. He is committed to her. He is in covenant with her, and he's married to her. And so she says, "Where is he?" Well, he's been here the whole time. It's just a dream in many ways, but it speaks volumes about what was happening in her heart. It speaks volumes about the struggle she had with intimacy in her marriage and her relationship with her husband. And I imagine after a dream like this, after this experience, she was much more careful about protecting that intimacy in her marriage. As she said in the end, "I belong to him and he belongs to me," just like Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I bet after this experience, she remembered to praise the good points of her husband and not focus on any negativity in the marriage. It's wisdom which is applicable to every married couple, isn't it? Even if we're embarrassed speaking about these things, the Word of God addresses them clearly for us. But even more than this, there's wisdom here for every single Christian. For every Christian who's married to Christ, there's something for you in this passage. We've looked together at intimacy which has been lost in marriage, but now let's look together at intimacy lost with Christ. Intimacy lost with Christ. Well, where did our story begin? It began with the woman, didn't it? And what did she say about herself? She said, "I slept, but my heart was awake." Now, sometimes that's a good description of many Christians, isn't it? Our hearts have been made alive together with Christ. We're co-heirs with him. Our heart is awake, but we've become sleepy. Spiritually, we've lost our fervour and devotion. We sleep, but our heart is awake. We know we're sleeping. We know we're backsliding. We know we've lost our first love. We're a bit like the church at Ephesus, which, when Jesus came and said, you've lost your first love. Sleeping, but our heart is awake. We all go through these moments of spiritual dullness, don't we? It's part of the ebb and flow of the Christian life. And sometimes God in his grace, when we're backsliding, when we're feeling so weak in faith, he comes to us and he knocks on the door of our life. Perhaps you see an allusion here to Revelation chapter 3 and verse 20. Christ came to the Laodicean church, didn't he? A church which was backslidden, a church which was asleep but awake, a half-hearted church. And he said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens up the door, I will come in and eat with him and him with me. And so the woman in our story who represents the church is a bit like the church at Laodicea. She knows Christ, but she's half-heartedly following him. She knows Christ, but he's on the outside of the door and not on the inside. So sometimes we get into this state of mind and Christ comes to us. We sense him drawing us. Come back to church. Come into my word. Come with me into prayer. And what do? Do we always listen to him? Not at all. Take a look at verse 3. We make excuses just like the woman makes excuses. She said, I've put off my garment. How could I put it on again? I've bathed my feet. How could I soil them? Sometimes when we're backslidden, we see God calling us to prayer and we say, no, not yet. Sometimes God calls a person back into church and they say, maybe next week I'll come back to church. He calls them into his word and they say, well, I'll read the word after I finish my program, and it never happens. Sometimes Christ comes to us to invite us into spiritual intimacy and we say, not tonight, Lord, I'm busy. All of us do it, don't we, if we're honest? Yet he continues to work in our hearts. He continues to be gracious, just like he did in verse 4. He says, my beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart was thrilled within me. And sometimes we have that experience, don't we, that Christ comes, we're dull, and it's as if he places his hand into our heart. He works on the inside, and then we think we're going to go after him. We're going to go and follow him. He calls us into that invitation, and like the woman, we get up and we're all enthusiastic. But sometimes this is what happens. Take a look in verse 6. The beloved had turned and gone. Sometimes we try and get back on track with God, and it's harder than we actually want it to be. It's harder than we expected it to be. And perhaps you've had that experience this week. You put Christ off and then you try to come to worship him, to fellowship with him. And there's a distance between you. It's hard. You don't sense his presence with you. Perhaps you can say what the woman said. I sought him but found him not. I called him but he gave no answer. Sometimes this is what happens, isn't it, as we try and get back on track with Christ. He seems to hide his face. He seems to be distant. And it sends us into a bit of a spin, just as it did to the woman. And what happened to her? She went out, and who found her? The watchmen found her. And they beat her, they bruised her, they took away her veil, those watchmen of the walls. Now, just as I said in chapter 3, when we looked at these things, the watchmen are a picture of the spiritual leaders of Israel, ministers of the gospel. And so what's the picture here? Well, the woman in a backslidden state, she goes to the watchmen of the walls, and they actually give her a bit of a beating. You think, well, what's going on here? What's that a picture of? Well, sometimes when someone's backslidden, when they're cold of heart, they come to speak to a pastor or another lively Christian. And they feel like they're getting beaten over the head with the scriptures. You tell them you should be in church, you should be reading your Bible, you should be praying. And they feel like they're becoming the victim of an overzealous watchman. I've seen it again and again and again. People take the watchman's instructions and think they're being harsh and they're giving me a beating, not knowing that it's actually for their good to protect and help them. But it's that hard word, isn't it, which gets her back on track. The watchmen come, they seem to be harsh with her. And at that moment, she turns to the daughters of Jerusalem, to the Christian community, and she starts to see their wisdom. She says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, you tell him I am sick with love. And that's a picture of the backslidden person, isn't it? Sometimes they'll say, pray for me. Please, pray for me. And of course we do. We love them. We want them to return. It's a familiar picture, isn't it, as we really examine the details of what's happening here. And when we're struggling, it's okay to ask other believers to pray for us. We shouldn't be ashamed to say, I'm struggling this week. Could you pray for me? Just as the woman did in the passage. Now, I'm sure the daughters of Jerusalem put a word in for her to the shepherd boy if they'd seen her going round about. But what they did was something actually better than that, wasn't it? They helped her think about why she had affection for him in the first place. In verse 9, they said, what is your beloved more than another beloved? What is your beloved more than another beloved, that you thus adjure us? And they stirred up her affections towards the husband. Yes, it's true, we need God's grace to come to us when we're backslidden and when we have a cold heart, but that doesn't mean that we are to sit idle. As Jude says, we are to keep ourselves in the love of God, stirring ourselves up through the great and precious promises of his word. We are to meditate on Christ, on who he is, what he's done for us. Just like the woman thought about the shepherd boy, we are to think about Christ when our hearts are growing cold. So if you're here tonight and your heart feels far from him, if that's the case, by all means tell someone to pray for you, but don't sit idle. Come to Christ yourself and think about who he is. And look at the amazing description she gives of him. She said, he's radiant and ruddy, chiefest among 10,000, saying he's beautiful. She says his eyes are like doves beside streams of water, a picture of his compassionate eyes. She says his lips are dripping with myrrh, sweet-smelling spices, speaking of the promises of God. His arms are like rods of gold set with jewels, his body polished ivory bedecked with sapphires. It's a picture of strength and kingship and majesty. His mouth is most sweet, and he is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. So when we're struggling, we should think on Christ's strength, think on his promises, think of his attributes, think of who he is. And you'll find your heart going after him once again, just as the woman did. In fact, you might even find that he's been there the whole time. Isn't that what the woman realized after some time? He's not abandoned her at all. His face has simply been hidden in this moment. And this is what God does with us sometimes, isn't it? He draws back and then we follow hard after him and we find that he was there with us the whole time. These are deeply experiential things. They're mystical things in many ways, but I know that you know something of what I'm talking about. And when we see him again, we go after him with a fresh zeal, a fresh commitment to his presence. We think, I don't want to drift again. I want to stay close to the shepherd. I want to stay close to the one who gave himself for me. This is how God deals with us in his wisdom, isn't it? So let's ask a few questions as we close tonight. Well, this evening we considered the second dream of the Shulamite woman. She'd married, but not everything was going happily ever after. The marriage was facing difficulty, even in the area of sexual intimacy. And let me say this, in a fallen world, in a world where everything is touched by the fall of Genesis 3, it shouldn't surprise us when we run into areas of conflict in our marriage, even in the areas of sexuality. So if you're struggling in that area, reach out to a trusted friend, perhaps someone who's older with the wisdom of experience, but don't struggle in your marriage by yourself. Whatever the problems, God's word and God's people will be able to give you wisdom in this area. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and seek to put it into practice by the help of God. If you're in a relationship with someone, try not to focus all the time on the negative, on all the problems and shortcomings in your marriage. Think of why you loved your spouse in the first place and celebrate all the good points you see in them, and you'll find your heart going after them in the relationship. But this passage also taught us about God, didn't it? It also taught us about our relationship with Christ. It showed us that spiritual slumber we can all fall into where our hearts are asleep, but yet they're sort of awake. It's sad, but it does happen. It happened at the Ephesian church. It can happen at Grace Church Gisborne as well. If that's what you're experiencing in your own heart, a dullness, then hear the wisdom of the passage. Don't stay sleepy in your bed. Go out and look for him, just like the Shulamite woman went to look for him. Go look for him in the church community, and don't stop seeking him until you find him, until that sense of fellowship is restored. Listen to the rebuke of the watchman, listen to the advice of the saints, and meditate on who he is. And I promise you, it won't be long before you're rejoicing in him again. It won't be long before you realize he doesn't ever leave you or forsake you. He simply hides his face in his wisdom to help you see your weakness. But perhaps there's someone listening online or at home, and they say to us in a disdainful way, what is your beloved more than any other beloved? What's so special about Christ? What's all the fuss about this man who died on the cross? Why is it that he is altogether lovely? Well, my response would be, find out what he was doing on that cross, and then you'll understand. Then you'll understand why he's altogether lovely, why he's the chiefest among 10,000. When you see that he died there under the curse of God, so you and I could be blessed. He died there so that we could be forgiven and be with him forever. When you understand that, it won't be long before you say, this is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. Amen.